Did I love you more? In your subjective experience.
Not then.
Oh! Wow, game, set, and match, Daniel.
The Goldwaters is brought to you by Goldwater Dubé, shaping the history of Canadian family law since 1981.
The Goldwaters vous est présenté par Goldwater Dubé, modeler l'histoire du droit familial canadien depuis 1981.
It's the Goldwaters. I'm your moderator, Dan Delmar, and I'm here with Dr. Samantha. How are you, Dr. Sam?
I'm doing great, Dan. How about you?
Great, thank you. And big topic on the show today, something that hits close to home for you guys, and that is sibling relationships. We'll talk about advice for parents and conflict resolution, and about some deeply personal stories on the podcast this time. Now, let's talk about how the podcast started, because it's I've known you guys for many years now, and you guys invited me over for Shabbat dinner one night, and I thought the dynamic between everyone was so interesting. Your mom is someone who really encouraged reading and debate and sort of intellectual development at the dinner table all the time, and I thought, what a great way what a great thing to make into a podcast. Was this a staple of your childhood, the fact that your mother really encouraged you guys to sort of get into it, to discuss and even debate?
It was something that both our parents really encouraged. Mom and Dad, I guess, they were never athletes, I guess, per se. And if they were going to have a sport, then it would be debate and discussion. That's something that they really enjoyed. And it's something that we were encouraged to enjoy growing up as well. So growing up, we did have a lot of big conversations over the table. We would even have, when our more extended family was still in Montreal, then we would have our Shabbat dinners, which had little to nothing to do with anything religious, but was just an excuse for the family to get together and just, talk about stuff. And it is one of the nicest memories of my childhood and my adolescence and going forward that we had this really nice kind of banter and exchange and real interest in exploring ideas and a lot of respect for each other and each other's views, even if we disagreed.
Now you're a parent of siblings as well. What have you learned from your dynamic with Daniel that you're applying to your own children?
I think that Dale and I, we've had our ups and downs in our relationship. As you'll hear in the podcast, we've had our ups and downs in our relationship over the years. But I do feel that it's tied together by a real love and, despite any minor spats over the years, a real mutual respect and consideration. And it's something that I really try to instill in the girls. So my girls are 2.5 and 6 years old now, and I really want them to, it can be really easy, particularly for the older one, to dismiss the views of the younger one for obvious reasons. She's 6 years old, the younger one's 2.5. She doesn't have as much, let's say, intellectual rigor or view. Her views, she tends to be a little bit more volatile because, again, she's 2.5, she's a little kid. But I really encourage them to really to respect what the other person's saying, to listen and to try to collaborate and to show a lot of mutual consideration.
There's some emotional moments in the podcast. What do you think of your mom and how she did to foster that relationship with your brother?
I think that Mom and Dad did the best that they could in terms of encouraging the relationship between Daniel and I, and particularly encouraging us to again, listen to each other and respect each other. We've had, in terms of in our family, I think one thing, because of Mom and particularly didn't have siblings, that sometimes boundaries were a little tricky in our family. But it's something that I feel that we've all, tried to tease out and have worked on over the years. And I think we've gotten to a pretty nice spot with that. So I think overall, for Mom and Dad, I think that despite having two kids with very, very different personalities and very different performance, like in academia and stuff like that, I think that they still encourage us to both respect each other and not to think more or less of each other.
All right, let's get into it. Siblings on the Goldwaters.
What's the earliest memory you have of really disliking me? I mean, my earliest memory, and this was a consistent thing over years, was that you always forbid me to go into your room. And you would close the door, and heaven forfend I go in there at all. And I never understood that, because I never had the same rule in my room, and I always just thought you were just like a piece of work. Like, what is your, like, what's your damage? And I remember really thinking, you're just like a bad person. Like, what's going on in your room that is so sacred, and why are you so putting so much effort into making sure I don't go near it? Like, I don't think there's anything you were hiding there. I think you just wanted to torture me, and you were drunk with power.
Well, I was drunk, but I don't know about with power. No, well, there's, I'm 3 years older than you are, so you were my bratty little brother. That was kind of it. I remember actually, it used to drive me nuts that you would, because I was, I guess more traditionally the firstborn child, so everything was neat, and, I had good grades, and I took things a little bit more seriously. You were a little bit more kind of scattered and disorganized, partly being a boy, just being a bit of a mess, so you'd wear like dirty sweatpants and run around and go crazy with your friends and break toys and things. And when you'd be...
Baseball bat, don't you remember?
I don't remember with the baseball bat.
Yeah, the little Superman characters, various superpower figurines there. He'd melt them in the microwave and then take a baseball bat and beat them up.
Right. And I remember at some point you complaining to me exactly about that. Like, why don't you, it's not fair. You don't let me into your room, And I think it's after I'd come and chastised you about it. And I remember just being exasperated and saying, Daniel, how do you think I even know you've been in my room? If you were in my room and you didn't move my stuff or break it, I wouldn't even know you were there. And that was my big argument, because you would go into my room and, I guess you don't remember this, but you would take things, you would break things and kind of leave them broken around. And that's why I didn't want you there.
Oh, pshaw.
Yeah. Oh, it's true. It's true.
You could just smell little boy stink, and you didn't like little boy stink in your room. And he would lose articles of clothing. I mean, there's a child who could lose his winter boots in the middle of the winter with 2 feet of snow outside at school, and I'd have to go to school and bring a pair of boots.
Well,
he would lose his gym shorts during gym.
Yes, but you're making my point, which is why I didn't want him touching my stuff in my room. Like, I loved you. We had a very love-hate relationship. But you would mess up my stuff and you would break it, and I didn't like that.
The problem with that, though, is that you would still forbid me in there when you were there, right? So when you were even there to supervise. Just admit, I mean, that's a fair enough reason, one reason of many, but the real reason is that you're an ice queen. Like, I thought that at the time. I was like, she's just an icy lady. Like, what's, like at the end of the day, oh, heaven forfend, I mucked up your,
No, wait a minute. This is a child, you must recollect, Daniel. I was the adult in the house, and she had a lock on her bedroom door at about the age of 5. I wasn't allowed in her room.
Right, so you're making my point.
Well, yeah, but you... Okay, yeah, I could be a little bit rigid, and even in the room with you there, I didn't want you, like, mucking up my stuff. And I think part of it, I didn't really understand you. And that was the bottom line. I didn't really understand you. Like, you were the little brother. You, like, made a mess. You, like, broke stuff. If we'd get, I remember at some point, I have this vivid memory of Mom and Dad buying us a pack of Bubblicious bubble gum. Mm-hmm. And it was, like, watermelon flavored or something. And so I, took my time. I had one piece. I chewed it. I enjoyed it. I, blew some bubbles. And that was it. And I saved the rest for later. And you took all 6 pieces and you put them all in your mouth all at once. And you couldn't even close your mouth. It was disgusting. There was, like pink, like, gobbing out in the front of your mouth. And then, of course, 5 minutes later, you spat it out. You could hardly breathe with all this stuff in your mouth. And then, maybe 10 minutes later, come over, show me your Bubblicious bubble gum. And it was like, I was just exasperated. There was so much, like, heavy, obnoxious girl sighing. It was just, ugh. Like, if you just did eat all your stuff at once, then we wouldn't have this problem. Then you wouldn't have to come take my stuff.
I have a very important question, though.
What?
Since you actually have a memory of Dad and me together, did Dad and I at least exhort you to share the gum with your little brother?
Yeah, you did. It drove me nuts.
Oh.
It drove me nuts because I didn't see it. Okay, any parent out there in the world, listen, this word will be very, very familiar to you if you have more than one child. Listen. It's not fair. that was the cry throughout. It was why if I eat one chocolate a day out of my advent calendar and Daniel eats every one all at once, why do I have to now share my advent calendar chocolate with him? Or if I eat like one piece of Bubblicious and I save the rest and he eats all of it, then why do I need to share with him? And it used to drive me mental.
I was such a bad mother.
Was the advent calendar for your Jewish children?
You knew exactly what I was going to say.
Well, I sped through it because I was eager for salvation through Jesus. Whereas my sister is happy being earthbound. You know, there's a lot of literature, a lot of research out there that I've read a bit about that. Firstborns tend to be leaders and tend to be very influential on their younger siblings, right? And so, is there anything that you can think of that you feel as though you influenced me in terms of like behavior that I sort of mimicked or that I was inspired by, because that would fit the pattern?
I think that's the impression I have, and as you're bringing it up now, is that I feel like through most of our development, I was more the brakes on you. Or that I was more the one who mitigated some of the consequences that you would receive. Like I was still the parentified child. I was still more the little adult. And so if there was an issue in terms of you having difficulties, or particularly in early adolescence and later, then parents would come. Mom and dad would talk to me. Particularly, mom would talk to me. And so I remember trying to rein certain things in, and in talking to you as when we were kids, maybe I was a bit more bratty about it, like get out of my room, get out of my stuff, stop doing that stuff. And as we got older and our relationship, I think, simmered down a bit, and we got, it was less, our relationship was less bipolar and a little bit more, even keel. I feel like a lot of times in our discussions, you tended to skew more extreme in terms of your views, in terms of the way you'd present things, and I was always more measured. And so I feel like a lot of our conversations ended up being that, was you presenting what I perceived as an extreme view, and me saying, whoa, simmer down a notch, and have you considered this, and this? And is that your perception? Like, I'm not sure how effective it was growing up or now, but that's kind of where...
No, that's a fair portrayal. I mean, I was thinking more in the question in terms of behavior again that I mimicked, or that I found inspiring.
I know in adolescence, when I was going through my mishigas, which
craziness.
Yes, Jew talk Yiddish for craziness. I remember that in my cohort we had several of us had younger siblings that were 2 grades down in your grade. And I remember that whatever nonsense we were getting up to, then your grade decided that it would be a grand idea to get into that nonsense as well. And so your grade ended up getting into a lot of mischief before we did, because you were doing
Can't
it.
Be
you were,
before.
Well, before
you mean at an earlier age?
Developmentally before we did, because you guys were like, let's say, a few months lagged from us in terms of engaging in the deviant behavior, even though you were 2 years younger, when you 3 years younger.
Ooh, I'm taking down that admission.
And so I don't
deviant
know.
behavior.
So I don't know if I influenced you specifically into engaging in any nonsense. I think if anything, my recollection of it, because that's at that time, that's when relationship was more, for me, was more tense between me and mom and dad, and particularly with mom, that I remember you really allied with mom very closely in ratting me out. That was really your role, that you were just, my impression at the time, and I could be wrong, is that you were just tickled pink to now be the good kid and I was the bad kid, and so you just jumped on that opportunity.
It lasted 6 months. Don't worry, Daniel.
Sure, that was I could be wrong. Like, I just remember that was my impression at the time.
My impression was more just that it was, I mean, I don't know if we've unpacked this enough for listeners to really to follow. I guess all you're referring to is that in your adolescence at one point you had a rebellious period, right? Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah.
Because it hasn't been explained to anybody.
Well, I think, yeah.
And there was a rift between you and mom, and you were acting out as teenagers do, right? So,
right.
But to me, during that period of time, my impression was just that there was such an about face, such a change, like a dramatic change in you, right? Because you went from this sort of stereotypically studious kind of introverted child.
Yeah, it was like the Lisa Simpson in the family, and you were
Right.
the Bart Simpson.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden you're recast as some sort of,
It's like the Darlene.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I don't know.
At the
Yeah.
time, that was so you.
Yeah, with a bit of sort of gothy type, whatever was in at that point to be consider yourself rebellious. And I found it. I just found it kind of outrageous at the time. I was like, what? I found it such a put on. I'm like, why is she? What a dramatic change in a person's demeanor. And I found it to be.
Well, that's funny. See, it's so strange. I've been listening to you speak for a while, and I have such a different perception. I think my perception is you started to become depressed as a preteen, not long before this period. This period is very specific. It's when you were 14, the year of 14, let's say. And the worst of it was about 6 months. So he would have been 11 because you have a birthday in the same
Right.
month. And that was the one thing. What cured you in one fell swoop was not all the parental intervention in the world or therapy or counseling or anything. One thing cured you is when the report cards came out and he had better marks than you. That
better
did
marks
you.
than me?
Yeah.
When?
That June.
I remember that the worst my grades ever went, and even in that period, was an average of 80.
Yeah, well, he had done better than you. Don't worry, it didn't last. It
Yeah,
didn't
one
last.
semester I think I had an 82.
Yeah, one semester. That was it. And the day you saw that, bang! It was
Really?
so over.
I
It was
have zero recollection of that.
that
at all.
was such a blow to your ego or something. It was like, what? I wouldn't do as well as numbnuts, my little brother. I don't know how you phrased it. That's how I sort of
But
perceived it.
I didn't. That's not at all my narrative. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, as I saw
Yeah.
it from the outside, living in the same house, clearly as clueless as any other parent of a teenager is. And I saw you as being in the rebellious phase, in fact, that you're most depressed. I think when you got past that, and that was that. There was that 6-month period. You were calling me Anne France. You were calling me by my name, which actually
Well, I was speaking to you at that time.
vaguely,
little bit, yeah,
occasionally,
yeah.
a little bit, right? And it was at the time, I remember, very wounding, very hard to take, and I knew I had no choice as a parent but to shut up and take it like a man, or whatever we say, take it like a parent. That's when the hair goes gray, And as soon as you got past that and everything normalized again, that's when you started to be a happier person, more self-confident, and going out more and having more friends. And I saw that unpleasant year as being essential to your individuation and your sense of your own personhood. So, which is why once it passed, maybe not when it was happening, but once it passed, I thought it was a great and necessary phase, terrible as it was to live through as a parent, right? But I didn't really perceive you, Daniel, as being that hostile to it. I think you really enjoyed having the reputation as the better child during that period.
Like was it that for you, or was it just that you were like, what the heck is going on with my sister, and like, is she okay, or like, were you mad? Or
No,
like, what was
I honestly remember being more closer to mad. I didn't see myself as being the better child. Took some glee. That wasn't my conscious thought in any of it. Really, it was just that you were that you had done this about face. You completely changed your presentation, and I thought that already was just suspect and kind of silly. And it was with the intention to wound and to hurt. Like family was how I perceived it. So yes, I did have hostility towards it. Mind you, that period in your life is what I think actually what brought us a lot closer. It was after that period when things started to normalize, and I think that we were able to have much more sort of heart-to-heart conversations and be more bonded. Prior to that, my older sister, my older kind of, with all the things that meant, it wasn't particularly close to you. It was just us kind of fighting each other over resources or whatever.
Yeah, over scarce resources.
Right. One thing I have to say in anticipation for this recording was that I kept finding myself thinking of the fact that my sister's a sister. She's not a brother. And I find that, to me, and I don't know if I was thinking to myself, am I profoundly sexist or something? But it's so powerfully, I find, disciplines the relationship or such a heavy factor. Like when I think, for example, of sort of mimicking, like I had friends who had older brothers and standard sort of cliche, like older brother does a jump on his bike, I'm going to do a higher jump, or, mimicking the older sibling. And to me, was always just not applicable because she's a woman. I'm a guy. And so I never felt... at least consciously, a sense of competition. I always thought we were just different categories. That it's like Samantha is a girl, and sort of like the Lisa Simpson, Bart Simpson sort of cliche. You know.
And as a side note, when Daniel was in school and he was little, he did actually insist on being him. Maybe for a few months, insist on being called Bart Simpson.
At least a year, and that
I think he insisted for a couple of months, and then the reputation followed him for another year or two at school. That people would still call him Bart, even when he wasn't as married to the name. Did you take me?
Like I saw you as like my sibling, as my sister, in terms of in terms of any dynamic that was produced from that. It was mostly, you shutting me out of your room, or you just shutting me out of things, like exercising older sibling power, and otherwise there were a few things we can get along with. I remember when we were kids, one of the best moments of our lives when we played Street Fighter together.
Yeah, it was fun.
And you were into playing Street Fighter with me, and it just kind of lasted for a few weeks. And I was that was like first time.
It lasted longer than that. For me, it was once video games got 3D. That and there was like perspective. That's when I was like, no, too many buttons. Like I'm not into it. I don't want to have to learn things. I want to just pick up and do. Yeah, it was just.
Yeah. So that's the thing. Like that's what's it's hard to think about sibling dynamics, whether it's rivalry or whether it's harmony, because I just the first thing I think of is the fact that I'm a boy.
Well then let me ask you about that, because while you're getting to gender differences, I guess in this is I remember when you became taller than I was. I remember that's one phase that I remember a lot when we were teenagers, and for our whole lives, I was 3 years older, so you always went to my lips. That's where the top of your head went. And then I remember when you got taller than me, and you just became, I don't know, you became antagonistic. Like in my perception, you would come over, you'd kiss me on the forehead, but it wasn't a sign of endearment. It was just this sort of kiss on the forehead that you kind of give me this look like, that's right, I'm bigger than you. And I remember this culminating in, I was getting ready in the bathroom or something like that, and I was doing my makeup or whatever it was, and you came in, you said you needed the facilities, and I said, okay, well, just give me 2 minutes, I'm almost done. And you just pulled big boy rank, and that was essentially it. You're like, no, get out, go to another bathroom. I'm like, no, I'm not going to. And then you pulled out the Joker of the deck, and you just dropped trowel and started. You were like, fine, I'm gonna do this. And I remember I was maybe 16 or 17. I remember just like leaving the bathroom, like screaming, like Mom, and being really really upset about that. Did you?
That was a major turning point. Yeah, there was sort of the before time and the after time. There was the before time when Samantha was larger than me, and so ultimately I had to give up. And then there was the after when I was larger, and it was just like whatever really you say or do is not as consequential. It's like you don't have any veto power anymore.
Did you feel that like mom or dad they somehow policed us? Like how did you feel like that they regulated our relationship? My impression is that they were mostly laissez-faire about it.
Yeah, they were. No, I don't think they were particularly that they policed us in particular. And again, if anything, and this is just my perception, which might be completely wrong, was that I always felt they kind of sided with me. It's like they're like, yeah, well, your sister is possessive and is obsessed with boundaries, and she's a little anal retentive. And
what do you think we were saying to her?
Well, then, as we got older, then how do you feel like our relationship has changed?
Well, I mean, we're generally more mature and insightful and better behaved, I suppose. I still
don't like it when you go in my room.
Right. It's true. It is true, actually. It is true.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I just find that...
Although now you don't like when I go in your room either.
That is true.
Right.
That is
How
true.
you've grown.
Well, no, just a matter of like me being naked with like adult parts. Like I don't want to shock you. So no, look, our relationship has definitely gotten better. I think we've gotten more mature and we get along well. But in terms of if we're still on that topic of rivalry, whether today or yesterday, it's not something I particularly identify with in terms of our relationship.
Do you feel that our relationship has given you anything? Because like there's some research, for example, that in sibling relationships, some of the positives that come out is that even in some of the conflict, that siblings have somewhat better social skills or conflict resolution, particularly because they have a lot of intensive practice resolving conflict every day. And that there could also be positive influences there as well. Do you feel that? Do you feel like other than annoying you in childhood, do you feel that anything that in our relationship has been beneficial to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that I think the closest I can get to sort of mimicking something in an older sibling, you, that I wanted for myself was, sort of your more measured, sort of careful thinking, like less sort of histrionic type of discourse, which I appreciate. I would integrate sometimes into my own thinking process. So there was a respect for your intellect. But otherwise, other things that I can think of that you gave me, and generally, it has to be, everything's under that kind of rubric, because that can translate to not just sort of academic or career-like applications, but also interpersonal applications, like how to, how better to listen to people and consider where they're coming from. And, to me, that's an intellectual exercise, right? And that was something that I think you did model, and that I did find beneficial. But
you feel emotionally that I don't know, that had any effect on you?
Well, yeah. Again, under that
Under
that
the
heading.
intellectual heading?
Well, I just think it translates. When you stop to see the world in terms of sort of contrasting ideologies or very sort of vast, sort of intellectually perhaps irresponsible ways, and you start to sort of focus in more and consider that what someone presents might not actually be what they believe, but it might be a sort of another dynamic. There might be something the way we treat our thoughts and our ideas has a bearing on how we treat people around us, right? It's like I found myself just becoming more accepting and gentle and considerate of other people's thoughts and behaviors. So it straddles different fields, emotional and intellectual.
Yeah, do you feel that either of you, as you were growing up, had to curry my favor, mine or Chaim's?
No.
Wow.
Not like I had to curry favor, that it was like an intense exercise, but I did often feel, I felt, I don't know if this should be edited out, but it was clear to me that Dad treated both of us fairly and both loved us the same. It was not clear to me with you. I always thought you loved me more than you loved her. That was it was that's how I felt. And it wasn't because of any particular, I don't know, it wasn't like there was any effort put into creating that situation.
Did you feel that, Samantha? Because really, that would be terrible.
That you love Daniel more?
Yeah.
No.
Oh, okay. Phew. Did I love you more? In your subjective experience?
Not then.
Oh. Wow, game, set, and match, Daniel. But why would you have believed I loved you more than Samantha?
I think you said so on certain
I said.
At least to me.
Yeah.
And I just thought that, look, you're more, I just thought that our temperament was a bit more similar. Again, our personalities, our temperaments have changed over time, but that, you're a bit more bombastic and impulsive, and so
are you.
Yeah,
right.
Just with the portrait we're painting, anybody who listened into this conversation, what would the unanimous opinion here that I was impulsive and kind of scattered as a child.
Well, you wore your emotions on your sleeve. Mm-hmm. I was much more guarded, and much more measured. And I think that if anything, and I saw it the same way that I see it, is that you were temperamentally very, very much like Mom, and I temperamentally was and am very, very much like Dad. So I
like
felt,
Bubby, like Dad's
yes,
mom.
I spent Dad's line, and I still spent a lot more time with Dad. So I felt much more of an easy affinity with Dad, and I felt that Dad and I had a much easy. Not that you and I, Mom, that you and I had a difficult relationship, but just that I felt that with Dad it was easy because I got him and he got me because we thought the same way. Whereas I think that, like Dad, my impression was that Dad found it more difficult to deal with you, Daniel, because it was, it was a little bit, because you guys weren't matched temperamentally. And maybe you and Mom, you had a much more explosive relationship, but it was more intense on all angles, because you guys were both more intense people.
Mm-hmm.
So how did that impact on the natural competition you must have felt to get our time, attention, and resources? Dad was teaching, was busy. He'd have to come home, mark papers, prepare lesson plans.
Dad was much more available and around than you were, because you stayed at work much later. Dad would be around. Dad had school hours, and so any of his prep stuff he didn't do when we were around. So we usually saw him, even after you guys split, we saw him after school until dinner, and then he would go home and he would do his stuff.
and I stayed out of the way at that time. You're talking the period.
Well, yeah, you were at work.
Right.
Yeah.
That was in fact, I thought, an ideal situation, because you then had uninterrupted time with Dad, that you could both have your, have like the one-on-one time, and then when I would come home, he'd leave, and then I could have time with you.
Right.
But I never felt any particular competition with Samantha for Dad's affection. Like I said, I think what I received was just that love and respected us the same, and I didn't feel any division.
I didn't feel a competition. There was no. I never felt a competition with you in terms of in any major sphere. The only place where I felt it somewhat was in terms of non-parental adult attention. Where it was like,
At
why
school.
are they? Yeah, at
like
school.
At school. But
at
not
school, that's
otherwise
right.
from us, the adults in the house.
No.
But I mean, I think the one place, if I had to just propose something for the sake of finding a place where we clash, or where there's a sort of an arena that the parents watch and kind of judge the winner, was these types of talks, these dinner table talks, right? There was a period, I think, when we were both teenagers, when that became more of a common thing, the sort of having big conversations at the dinner table with both Dad and Mom present, and we'd have these debates. And there was an element of, and it's very soft, I don't want to overstate it, but of who kind of put forward the more dynamic arguments, right?
I never really felt that there was a competition in that way, though. Like, I don't have a distinct memory of like, Daniel won this round, or I won this round, and like,
But what was nice about that at the time that I remember is Dad obviously loves every conversation, but Daniel would be the provocateur even then. And we're talking a good 20 years ago, and he'd come up with a topic like, why don't we eat people, for instance? Like normal dinner time conversation.
Dale, you had a lot of conversation about cannibalism. It was really like, I don't know.
Was it just cannibalism? No, it was, I wanted to have some sort of, I don't know, it's like the McLaughlin group or something. I would come in and I'd be like, all right, guys, there's this Columbine, talk about school shootings that never go away. Let's talk about, I don't know, do video games really affect children's propensity to violence? Or, I'll try to engage in debates. Some of them were more outrageous than others, but that's how I perceived the theater of our family.
Do you feel that Dad and I were able to foster, it's not enough to just have a debate or just be provocative at the table, but to feel that you had a legitimate voice and that we were providing you actual materials to permit you to think critically and to think politically and to contribute to public discourse?
It's one of the things that Dad said when we were growing up, that that one of the most important things is to give people face. And I don't think I totally understood what he meant at the time. And, like many things Dad said, it took me some years to be able to really get it. Or grok it, as it were. And I think that he did give us face, both Dale and I. I never remember feeling diminished by anything that he or you said to us. That whenever we were having debates or conversations at the table, and if I think about it to a certain extent, yeah, of course, Dale and I are brilliant and wonderful and everything. Yeah, sure. But we were also, snot-nosed kids and slightly less snot-nosed teenagers. And I'm sure that our views weren't that well informed, and there was a lot of stuff we said that was probably, audacious or ridiculous. But I always felt that you and Dad respected what we said, and that you treated what we said as though, as you would any other adult that you respect. And that's something that I do feel that you and Dad gave us really intensive early training in analytical reasoning. That is something I remember realizing this when I was in grad school and meeting, meeting my peers who were brilliant and had all these fantastic skills, and recognizing that, some of them had much better processing speed than I did. Some had better memory than I did. But the one thing that I always felt really confident in is analytical reasoning. That as soon as someone would say something, I knew I was always a confident speaker, even if I didn't feel confident internally. And I knew how to see the holes in what they were saying and break it down. And I wasn't afraid to get into a debate. Like, I remember when friends would come visit, sometimes they would find our interactions intimidating, and they would say, like, "Oh, are you guys arguing? Like, what just happened there?" And they would be really, hesitant to jump in. And I remember, I don't know about you, Daniel, but I remember looking at them really quizzically when they would say stuff like that. Like, what? This is just how we talk. It's one thing that I can say that I really appreciate in our family dynamic is that we really we really just spoke really well and easily and analytically together, and it was an area where we can have different views and still support them and discuss them respectfully. And it's something that I really appreciate in the way that I was brought up. It's one thing I can say about our family is that we have really great conversations.
And you, Daniel?
Yeah, I feel likewise. You know, I'm hesitant to go towards other sorts of sort of stereotypes to try to label it and organize it a bit better. But you know, there's a bit of a Jew cliche of being sort of talky, over talky intellectuals and kind of
neurotic too,
neurotic and Talmudic kind of leanings of debating things both banal and profound. And I also felt that there was a certain snobbishness. If I had to kind of highlight things that I felt might have been dangerous in that sort of dynamic, was that there was this perception that this is sort of like the price of admission to the family. That if other people, friends or people that I knew could not, were not inclined in that fashion, then they were considered just other or different.
Really? I don't remember any of our friends participating in any of our conversations in any meaningful way.
Wow, that's terrible in a whole other direction.
No, I didn't think less of my friends for it. I just didn't. It wasn't an expectation. Like there was no value judgment in it. It just. To me, it just is.
Were you self-censoring and not? Well, no, the friends were always around.
No, but but it wasn't. They weren't part of the bigger discussions. Like I think a lot of them still were intimidated to jump in.
But yeah, but intimidated not necessarily because there's something so awesome about us, as much as just displaying a certain arrogance. This is unpleasant. Like I found that growing older, I've realized that like every single girlfriend or friend or boyfriend, person I've ever known, secretly thinks I'm like an arrogant piece of work, and like just this one of the most unpleasant things about me. I've come to understand, and
I think that's just you.
It's just me. No, I mean it's been said. I remember.
Yeah. Although I agree with you, many of the conversations that we can have and have had at the dinner table en famille, the three of us, and with Dad in particular. When we've had political conversations about history, conversations about science, may go above and beyond the ken of a lot of people, but it doesn't in any way change their worth or how much we love or appreciate people who don't have that particular skill any more than if a friend would come over and play the piano. Just because we can't play the piano at his level doesn't make us inferior to him or unable to have loving, amicable relationship. But hang on a sec. I really don't believe that there was anything in the way that we debated and conversed with each other that expressed an arrogance between us, that we're having these debates on this level because we're better and more awesome than anybody else.
Mom, I'm actually curious because I do feel that, some of the discussions we've had, we were talking about how the sibling relationship or family relationships has changed or affected our development in some way. You were an only child and, you didn't have a mom. And I just wonder, in terms of being an only child, did you ever have a memory of like missing having siblings or wishing you had siblings, or how did that work for you growing up?
Well, I grew up in a pretty strange environment. You have to consider, it was a little strange when I was growing up because there was my father, his brother, and two sisters. And the only people of the next generation, Judy had one son, he was an only child. So I was not exposed to a dynamic of siblings or a big family. And the only siblings I actually knew were my father, my uncle, and my two aunts. And they had a terrible, terrible relationship all their lives because my grandmother was a foul and evil witch who encouraged them to fight with each other, to play off each other, to make alliances with one against the other. And that's how she maintained her power and dominance over them and essentially destroyed their lives. So there is nothing that I could miss because I didn't perceive anything positive in there. And there was nothing I could do, much as I tried helplessly when I became more aware of it as a teenager and a young adult, and I tried to foster some sense of familial relationship and mutual care and consideration and so on. And there was nothing I couldn't even do anything with my grandmother. I couldn't even do it. So I said, "You're the mother. You should encourage your children to get along with each other. You should say, I am the mother, and unless you get along, I'm out." Because obviously they were not at an age where she could send them to their rooms. They were married people with children themselves, but she could foster their mutual respect, and she wouldn't do it. She just wouldn't do it. So the only thing I'm proud of, and it for some reason only occurred to me in the last couple of weeks, I don't know why it took till age 57 to realize that, but maybe because of conversations with my cousin Lynn, is, I'm kind of proud that I sheltered you from that, and that you grew up not knowing these people, because you didn't need to know them. You didn't need to be exposed to spiteful and hateful relations and people who backbite and quarrel and I don't know how much of it contaminated me. Some of it did, certainly. The bad temper I had more years ago than now. But I'd like to think I sheltered you from most of that toxicity, because I am delighted to hear things when I hear the two of you exchanging with each other, that you grew up not feeling you had to compete for resources, not feeling that you were treated differently, not feeling that in conversations at the dinner table that your views were anything but completely respected as autonomous people. And Lord knows you're politically very different. We have very, very different opinions about world affairs. And that comforts me and makes me feel that the abuse I knew in my past has not been communicated to the next generation.
Do you ever feel jealous when you see
all the time
of Daniel, but of that Dale and I have each other, and that we have? Because I know you've spoken a lot in the past about having kind of a parent-shaped hole in your heart, but we haven't really ever discussed the being the only child part. And do you ever see Dale and I and think like, oh, I wish I had that? Or is it something that doesn't really come up, or just like, oh, good, like I'm glad I didn't have to deal with?
I've always been glad for Daniel that he has somebody to confide in you for the things that you don't want to talk about to a parent. So I've always been happy for him, and I certainly have always been jealous that you've been able to have, both of you, more normal relationships. And many times I've wished that you, Samantha, that you and Constantine were my parents, which must sound very twisted, but I just mean that in as primitive an animal way that I can say it's going to make me cry. But you're both so calm and so respectful and so considerate of your children. And I just sit there and I just wish you were my mommy and daddy. I'm starting
to cry.
And how careful you are with your daughters, not to permit competitiveness or fighting between them, and to give them very individual attention, and they are so different. They're so insanely different. Eva, who would go outside today if it were 20 below in t-shirt and shorts, and little Nina, I have to put on her sweater and zip it to the top, and her jacket and her hat and her scarf and her gloves, because she likes to go out properly dressed. So there they are. They're so tiny and they're so different. And you accommodate those differences. You don't require them to be the same. You don't oblige them to you don't constrain how they express those differences, right? And I would love that, because I see the emotional stability that it gives them, and I really wish I could have that emotional stability, because I think having that emotional stability as little children must be foundationally so great for when you're older.
That's really sweet and really sad.
Yeah, well, yes. Well, thank you for my grandchildren. If I had to give advice on how to deal with having siblings, obviously when you have one child, you can treat that child as the apple of your eye, and the poor child can just be crushed under the weight of all your expectations that are thrust upon his or her narrow shoulders. When you have two or more children, there's a whole other level of complexity, because no matter how many children you have, each one is going to be approximately the opposite of the previous child. And I marvel how families I've met when there are 4, 5, and 6 children, how each of those children can be so different from the other. It's not just binary the way it can be in two-child families. So if I had to give a word of advice, I would have to suggest that before you have your first child, and recognize that this person who's going to come into your life is so hugely and completely different from you and your partner, no matter what the circumstances of the conception of that child and how that child's come into your life, that the hardest lesson you have to learn from the beginning, which is to permit that child to individuate. And don't compare siblings to each other. That's a hard lesson too to learn, because when you get mad at the one, you'll say to the other, well, why don't you take your bath on time like your brother? You must never do that. Never encourage that competitiveness. And since you have the advantage anyway, because your children are going to be so different from each other that unless they're the Williams sisters, that one may be good at tennis and the other one's good at golf. So encourage and validate those differences, because that's what's more common, is kids, again, have different interests and abilities. And perhaps, again, the hardest one of all is the one that I referenced at the beginning of this little diatribe, which is don't crush your children under the weight of your expectations. It's very hard to let a child flourish and discover what he or she wants to do. And I'm still not sure how to do that. And I've had 2 children, and I'm there trying to be there for my grandchildren too. But you have to wait to discover who they are as they discover that, and accompany them in that process. And if you can be a partner in that process, like in that lovely way Samantha described, where when she and her brother were little snot-nosed kids, they can sit at the dinner table and voice opinions and have those opinions respected. You know, fortunately, one day you will get to my age and find that you're learning more from your children than you were ever able to teach them, because the future is theirs, after all. And what they teach you is always going to be richer and deeper for your understanding as an old person like me than anything you could discover on your own. So for whatever that's worth, that and $5 will get you a cup of coffee. But I think that would be my word of advice.
And I think the one thing I'd add to that is encouraging conflict resolution skills in siblings. That's where that relationship, the sibling relationship. It struck me at the wedding of, I have a very good friend who has a twin brother. They're fraternal twins. And at his wedding, he was, afterwards he was giving speeches, and he spoke about her, and he referred to her as his womb mate. And it was just in saying that it really kind of sunk in that the sibling relationship is one of the longest relationships, assuming all goes well, it's one of the longest, most intimate relationships you're going to have in your life. You live with that person through all your formative years. You have a lot of shared experiences, and partners, often romantic partners come and go. Parents tend to, die sooner. And so with siblings, that's one of the longest relationships you'll ever have. And I think it's important to really foster a lot of, collaboration and conflict resolution skills between siblings, and encourage, encourage them to individuate and to have a really respectful attitude towards each other. And to touch back on what you were saying, Mom, in terms of, respecting, each child's unique personalities and trying to bring that out. I'll just give the TLDR version of it, which is the dad line, which is, give face. Give face.
Good old dad.
It's interesting that you say that, Daniel, because it's something that I've noticed too, that along with, in terms of our relationship, that I don't feel I've been as available emotionally or otherwise to you as I was before the kids. And we don't hang out as much. We definitely don't hang out as much as the two of us. Mm-hmm. And we don't share as many personal experiences or hardships with each other. And I think that's, and you're right. A lot of it has just been that the kids have kind of eaten up my time and my attention and my resources, and in a wonderful way. But I do feel a bit more distant since the kids have been born. And if I think on a more basic level in terms of how I raise the kids and how our relationship has affected how I raise the kids, it's hard to draw any direct parallels. I think I still see my relationship with you as having been and being overall positive and intimate, and I hope for the girls that what I try to encourage in the girls is that they have that they can be there for each other, that they can have a relationship with each other that's independent of Constantine and I, and that they could figure things out for each other, and that they can be attentive to, it's one thing that I try with both of the girls is to have them both be attentive to each other's emotional states, and to be able to respond empathically and reasonably to that. If the girls end up having a relationship like ours, then of course my kids, I always hope everything's going to be bigger and better and more wonderful than my experience. But if they do end up having a relationship like ours, then I'll think I still did a pretty good job as a parent.
Yeah, they won't be playing Street Fighter 2. They'll be playing Street Fighter VR or something.
I think they were playing Angry Birds before. Does that count?
Right.
All right, so a lot of emotion on this episode, Samantha. A lot of practical advice as well. I want to pick up on something that you mentioned just a little while ago: conflict resolution. When we come down to individual sibling rivalries, you can go back to Cain and Abel. What is the best way to encourage a healthy rivalry, if such a thing exists among siblings?
Well, I'm glad you didn't say to discourage any rivalry between siblings, because of course any person that you're living with in closed quarters for many years, you're gonna bump heads and you're gonna have conflict and disputes, and I think that's totally normal. So I think from a parent perspective, I think on the one hand it's important to recognize that your kids will fight, that they're gonna argue, and that's normal, and that's part of having kids. Now, within reason, of course, if the kids are getting, and I think that on the most part for parents, it's important if it's minor disputes to give the kids a few minutes at least to kind of try to figure it out themselves, to see if they can kind of reconcile and they can come to some sort of middle ground, and intervene only when the volume is kind of escalating a little bit more, or if anything physical is involved, or intervene afterwards in terms of discussion. How do you think that went? I think what's important in encouraging any sort of conflict resolution is encouraging both sides to hear each other out, like to really listen to what the other person's trying to say. So with my girls, I really try to encourage them to be aware of each other's emotional states. So how does, asking the older one and asking the younger one, well, how does the other one feel? Why do you think she feels that way? What do you think happened? What do you think she wants right now? And encouraging them to tell each other specifically, kindly, and respectfully what they want. So my girls can say anything as long as they say it in a respectful tone. So they can say to each other that they don't like what the other one did, that they want one thing or they want the other or the other one did something that was undesirable, but as long as they say it in a polite tone. And I think that really encourages them to kind of regulate themselves. So I won't let either of them answer each other unless they're speaking in a respectful tone, and I won't answer them unless they're speaking to me in a respectful tone. I'll just keep repeating, I don't understand that tone, or I don't, sorry, I didn't understand that. And then once it encourages them to kind of regulate themselves and keep their emotions a little bit more even keel, and then to really be able, and in that state, to be able to really listen. And there's times where there's, when it comes to conflict over, let's say, scarce resources, like they want to watch the iPad or something like that, then a lot of the line I'll use with them is, and they start arguing about whatever show it is that they're going to put on, it's, okay, well, you guys have to find something you both agree on, and if you don't, neither of you are watching. That seems to work really well to calm them down pretty quickly, and they quickly come to a compromise. So I think it's respecting that accepting there's going to be conflict, recognizing they're going to have different views, and there's nothing wrong with that, and encouraging them to be attentive to each other and respectful with each other, even if they disagree.
Finally, we didn't address only children much on the program, but do you have any advice there for parents of only children? Are we missing out on something? And is there sort of some compensating that has to go on there if you don't grow up with another peer in the home?
I think that, interestingly, in terms of the research, as far as I'm aware, only siblings tend to do kind of similarly to firstborn siblings. So they tend to overperform at least a bit in terms of the traditional measures of, quote, achievement. But I think one thing that's important, at least socially, is that for only kids that you need to compensate by giving them more time with other kids. So I think for only kids, they do tend to spend more time with cousins. They do tend to spend more time, let's say, at daycare or on play dates and other things. So it's recognizing that they need social time somewhere. Because I think one thing that ends up, that I notice at least in my practice is when parents are coming in with only children is that we don't realize as adults how easy it is for us to accommodate kids. So when a child will say something to us, we can easily talk about only what they want to talk about, play only the games they want to play, put on only the music that they like to listen to, because for us, what's the big deal? A sibling ain't gonna put up with that nonsense. A sibling's gonna fight, and a sibling's gonna want their needs heard too, and talk about their stuff and play their things. And so it's important to give, if you have an only child, to expose them to enough other kids that they have to resolve those conflicts between each other. And or if you don't have as many kids around, to be able to introduce as a parent your own wants and needs. So encourage still turn taking, that, sometimes, sorry kiddo, today we're listening to my music, or sorry kiddo, now we're gonna listen to, I know you wanna watch that thing, but we're gonna watch my show for the next 15 minutes. Or, you want this for dinner? That's great, you'll have it for dinner tomorrow. Tonight, this is my choice. So to give kids a little bit of the understanding that the world doesn't totally revolve around them, that they have to consider other people's wants and needs.
Good advice. Thanks, Dr. Sam.
Thanks, Dan.
And don't forget to listen to past episodes of The Goldwaters at thegoldwaters.ca. Subscribe on iTunes or your favorite podcast platform. And do stay tuned because we have Valérie Plante, the new mayor of Montreal, coming up on a podcast very soon. And we're looking to hear from you as well directly. Just drop us an email, talk@thegoldwaters.ca, if there's anything you want to hear the Goldwaters debate. I'm Dan Delmar. See you next time.
Yay.
Thank you.
This has been a production of TNKI Media. Good talk.